What do you think of yourself? It's an interesting question, isn't it? How would you describe yourself to others? Well, in our verse today, it's Ephesians chapter 3 and it's verse 8. Paul describes himself like this: although I am less than the least of all the Lord's people, this grace now given me to preach to the Gentiles the boundless riches of Christ. This privilege that he had of sharing the wonderful gospel, the gospel that can bring about this wonderful mystery that Jews and Gentiles can be united, is given to Paul, and yet he says, even though I'm less than the least. That's what the literal translation of his description of himself is. And this isn't mock humility. This is Paul understanding himself for who he really is. Remember, Paul, before he was remarkably converted, he was this strict Pharisee. Paul studied the law of Moses fastidiously. He knew the righteous requirements and demands of the law. And so he knew now that God had opened his eyes to see his own sin and his own failings and his need of a saviour. He saw how incredibly short he fell. This was someone who went about persecuting Christians as well. And so Paul knows that he is weak and frail. He goes on to describe himself in 1 Timothy 1 verse 15. He's the chief of sinners. And yet in realising his great sin and his great need and his great weakness, this causes him to rely so much on God's grace working through him. Somebody once said it's not so much great talents that God uses, but it's great likenesses to Jesus. And Paul seems very much like this. He seems so like the Saviour in his humility and in his desire to declare the greatness of Jesus. And how does he describe it? This gospel that he's sharing to the Gentiles, the boundless riches of Christ. Just his very description of what the gospel is just shows how it moved and overwhelmed, thrilled him. And that's the same for every single one of us. If we get the privilege of sharing the good news of Jesus, let's make sure we understand what it really is. It's the boundless riches of Christ. What a message all of us as believers have to share. What a privilege.